Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. The big news over the last week was two very important Supreme Court rulings. The first case, 303 Creative versus Ellenis. Aubrey Ellenis is the director of the Colorado Civil Rights Division. The state passed a ruling compelling a Christian web designer to create websites for same-sex marriages, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Christian web designer. The other case was Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard College. Harvard was accepting or denying students on the basis of race. The Supreme Court ruled against Harvard and overturned the practice of affirmative action in college admissions. In both cases, the court's conservative justices all voted for the plaintiffs. Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Barrett all voted for the plaintiffs. And the leftist judges, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, all voted against the plaintiffs. And this divide happens continually. How can it be that these judges always fall on different sides of an issue? They all went to the same law schools. They all read the same law journals. Why do they fall into two distinct sides? And for that matter, notice the public is the same way. The public is divided into two different parties that each hold to diametrically opposed moral positions. There's a timeless lesson that we can learn here about there being two different sources of morals, two different ways of determining right and wrong. And if we don't understand the different foundation for ethics driving this divide, we're going to be like most people in the public, totally in the dark concerning the moral battle of the ages. The spiritual decision that must be made by everyone in this life, either for God or against God. There's a reason why, as it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 2, a wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. There's a reason why in ancient Israel there were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the conservative Pharisees and the liberal Sadducees. In Greece there were the liberal Epicureans and the conservative Stoics. In every culture there's been a divide between conservatives and liberals, between the political left and the political right. Now, sociologists will explain it as people having different needs. For example, older people might want to hold on to traditions, and younger people might want something new. Those who are in the city might have a need for socialism, working together, while those in the country might have a need for independence. And so the explanation is given in terms of Darwinistic survival of the fittest, natural selection. But those are very superficial explanations for the divide, and those explanations have been proven to be inconsistent. People with similar needs often take different positions. The true explanation is that it all comes down to how people determine right from wrong, what is called one's moral foundation for ethics. That's the real difference. And some people determine ethics on the basis of human utility, what's good for man, and other people determine ethics on the basis of the higher moral code coming from the law of nature and nature's God. Take, for example, the abortion issue. If right and wrong are determined by what is good for you, or rather, right or wrong are determined by your personal preferences, everyone would agree that pro-choice should be the law of the land. I mean, the philosophy is right in the title, pro-choice. Morals are based upon your own choice, human autonomy. But if morals are based upon a divine moral code, thou shalt not kill, even if it's inconvenience to you not to kill, then everyone would agree abortion is wrong. So when it comes right down to it, there are only two foundations for ethics. man, or God. Either right or wrong are determined by human utility and human autonomy, which is called humanism, or right and wrong are determined by theism. And this is the battle of the ages, man versus God. So this is all very basic, and I apologize for having to cover it again, but so many people don't understand this. And we're not going to be able to understand these Supreme Court rulings unless we have this basic understanding of the whys and the wherefores behind moral decisions. Let me again encourage you that when you get into any political discussion with coworkers or neighbors or family members, don't get sucked into arguing the details of the abortion issue or the gay rights issue or socialism or about any particular candidate. Instead, lay the axe to the root of the tree. Ask the question, how do you determine right from wrong? Or the question, by what authority do you say these things? That's a discussion that gets people to address the real issue, which is autonomy from God or obedience to God. We're never going to change people's minds about social political issues until we change their foundation for ethics. So let's talk now about the mindset of these leftist Supreme Court justices, the mindset of every leftist. Notice this text in the Bible, Proverbs chapter 28, verse 5. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all things. Notice we have two categories. Those who are called evil versus those who are the seekers of God. Those who go to God for their moral opinions. And we see that this divide between how people determine justice is not simply a matter of preference. There are people who are evil, who thereby become morally ignorant. They do not understand justice. And there's another class of people who are good, who have moral understanding. Now, someone might look at this text and say, it really tells us nothing. The left can call the right evil and claim that the political right doesn't understand justice, and the right can call the left evil and claim that the political left doesn't understand justice. And who are the right and who are the left? And this is exactly what happens on political talk shows. Well, that ambiguity would be true if we start off assuming some sort of moral relativism, where you have your truth and I have my truth. But throughout the Bible, there are clear standards of right and wrong. The good is defined as those who seek God. These are the ones who get their moral foundation and their understanding from God and His revelation in Scripture. If that's not your source, you end up being in the category of evil men who do not understand justice. Proverbs 25:14. The secret of the Lord is for those who fear Him, and He will make them know His covenant. Psalm 119:99. I have more insight than all of my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. So here is how the unsaved, unregenerate mind works. Justice, what is right, is based on outcomes, personal outcomes. Justice works backwards. It starts off by asking the question, what will be a good outcome for me? And then it determines the moral position. It's basically man-centered morals. It may be compassion, but it's compassion for me. It's compassion for sinful humanity. Compassion can be sympathy for the devil. For example, someone thinks, I don't want a child. That wouldn't be good for me. Even if I ever have a baby and it would be inconvenient, I want to have the choice not to have the baby. So therefore, abortion must be okay because the moral position fits what I desire, fits what I consider good. So what is right must be based upon what best helps me. And corrupt politicians think the same way. They never consider themselves evil, or they never consider that they're doing evil. They simply believe that whatever advances them personally must be right. They think, since my cause helps me, it must be good. And if it helps me, it certainly in some way helps everyone else. I mean, why not take a bribe? Because it'll bring about a greater good for a greater number of people. So therefore, it's not really taking a bribe. It's simply people supporting my good cause. So ethics, therefore, become situational ethics, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And since it's doing me good, and I'm one of those people, and I'm not really hurting anyone else, it must be okay. In the minds of these people, who are described in the Bible as the ungodly, there is no consideration, or at least little consideration, that what is right and wrong might go against what is good for them in the short term, or what they desire in this world. Job chapter 21, verse 14, they say to God, depart from us. We don't even desire knowledge of your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what would we gain if we entreat him? On the other hand, the righteous man understands that to do right, he must first deny himself. He must deny the sinful self if he is to follow the higher law of God. Psalm chapter 15, verse 4, the righteous man swears, or rather keeps a promise, even to his own hurt. Well, why would he do that? Because God's law comes above what benefits him in this world. In mankind's first sin, Eve disregarded God's law by putting herself first. Genesis 3:6. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. So if you're struggling with sin, you're never going to have victory until you understand this principle of self-denial. That God comes first, you come second. 2 Chronicles 19. Judges were not to rule for man's sake, but for God's sake. Verse 6. He said to the judges, consider what you're doing, for you do not judge for man, but for the Lord, who is with you when you render judgment. This verse is often misunderstood, along with Deuteronomy 1:17. You shall not fear man, for the judgment is God's. These verses are not teaching that judges have some sort of divine right of kings, that whatever they rule is God's verdict. No, the verses mean that you're not to judge for man, for human pragmatism or human utility, but you're to judge for God. However, let's remember that unrighteous politicians, judges, don't even think in those terms. They believe justice is based upon affirming themselves and affirming humanity. And the Bible calls these people unprincipled men. 2 Peter 2:7. God rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men. 2 Peter 3:17. You therefore, beloved, knowing this beforehand, be on your guard, so that you're not carried away by the error of unprincipled men and fall from your own steadfastness. Now, it's not that these people don't operate on a principle. It's just the wrong principle. So they're described as being without the true principle, the true basis for justice. Because if one's principles are not based on the laws of the Creator, they're not principles at all. One more point to consider. Having the wrong basis for ethics doesn't matter whether you're just a man on the street or a highly educated lawyer. Both can operate on the wrong foundation for justice. The educated lawyer, the Supreme Court justice, may be able to give high-sounding justifications, but they can be building all of this intellect on a faulty foundation. The edifice might look impressive, but it's built upon sand, as Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice from 1902 to 1932, was considered one of the greatest legal minds in America. But he believed that law is whatever the dominant forces in society want. And he became the father of 20th century law positivism, or what's called legal positivism. It's a fancy label for a belief that what is right is whatever man decides through his own social constructs. Holmes was a Darwinist, an atheist. He didn't believe divinity, God, formal natural law should have anything to do with the American legal system. Holmes was intelligent, but he was a religious apostate. The gifts and the calling of God are without repentance. We can either use our gifts for God or against God. These three leftist judges on the Supreme Court, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, all follow the philosophy of law positivism. That law is based upon man, upon human utility and pragmatism, rather than law being based on the eternal, unchanging law of God. And this is why these three leftist judges always agree and always vote in a certain way. So now in regard to these two cases, first, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, the majority conservative opinion of the court was that Harvard was violating the Fourth Amendment equal protection under law clause. And Harvard was violating the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that you can't discriminate on the basis of race. Now, universities may decide to admit an individual who has had to overcome difficulties. So some minorities may indirectly be favored, but admission cannot be based solely upon a person's ethnicity or skin color. Harvard was denying Asians entrance simply because they had too many Asians, according to their racist worldview, where it's not about the individual, but it's about skin color groups, which is the very definition of racism. So Harvard was determining the student body by racism, the color of people's skin, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act ruled that race is not a righteous basis for discriminating or judging in a public institution. Here's an article interviewing a member of the board of Students for Fair Admission. Ken Shu is ecstatic that the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the use of race as a factor in college admissions last week after he spent years pushing for a race-blind America. Quote, "What I've always wanted and what Americans should have is a merit-based society. People are diverse, but they're different. Diverse in more than just race. They're diverse in talent, skill, ambitions." Shu, who authored the 2021 book, An Inconvenient Minority, the Harvard admissions case, and the attack on Asian American excellence. He has long felt Asian Americans were getting a raw deal in higher education. Quote, "It just so happens that Asian Americans are academically excellent, disproportionately so. They should then be rewarded for that. People who are disproportionately excellent in athletics, business, and artistically are also celebrated." Unquote. What Harvard was doing was no different than a college denying admission to blacks or Latinos on the basis of some racial quota. Why would it be wrong to have a racial quota limiting the number of blacks, but right to have a racial quota limiting the number of Asians or Jews or Latinos? The three leftist Supreme Court justices gave their dissenting opinion, and it was basically it's right to have that double standard. They argued that The Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution permits consideration of race to achieve its goal, that people can't be colorblind in a, quote, endemically segregated society, that previous laws allowed for judgment based upon race, and that we have to discriminate in order to prevent discrimination. The dissenting opinion was a lot of double talk, that it is discrimination to deny a person on the basis of the race, but then you have to deny a person on the basis of the race. The opinion was very convoluted and obscure. But the underlying premise, which was never admitted, was this: a certain kind of racism is okay when it comes to certain minorities, particularly blacks, because it results in a certain preferred outcome. And as I mentioned earlier, that is the leftist view of justice, where justice is not based upon the immutable higher law of God that's equally applied everywhere, but it's based upon preferred outcomes. It's a foundation for ethics based upon outcomes. These people work backwards. What is right is what gives them the outcomes they want or like. So Clarence Thomas, the conservative black member of the court, let Justice Jackson know what he thought of her dissenting opinion. Quote, accordingly, Justice Jackson's race-infused worldview falls flat at each step. Individuals are the sum of their unique experiences, challenges, and accomplishments. What matters is not the barriers they face, but how they choose to confront them. And their race is not to blame for everything, good or bad, whatever happens in their lives. A contrary myopic worldview based upon individuals' skin color, to the total exclusion of their personal choice, is nothing short of racial determinism. Justice Jackson then builds her faulty premise to call for action, arguing that courts should defer to experts and allow institutions to discriminate on the basis of race. Make no mistake, her dissent is not a vanguard of the innocent and the helpless. It is instead a call to empower the privileged elites who will tell us what is required to level the playing field among castes and classifications that they alone can divide. Then, after putting us all into racial castes and pitting those castes against each other, the dissent somehow believes that we will be able, at some undefined point, to march forward together into some utopian vision. Well said, Clarence Thomas. You can't cure racism with more racism. Now, the second case that the leftist members of the court unanimously dissented against, as expected, was the 303 Creative versus Ellenist case. The case where the courts ruled that a Christian web designer could not be forced by the state of Colorado to make websites for homosexual weddings. Now, at first you might have thought like I did. I thought this whole issue was settled in the Masterpiece cake case, where the Supreme Court sided with Jack Phillips that he didn't have to make a cake for a homosexual wedding because his free speech was violated. But the same Colorado Civil Rights Commission that went after Jack Phillips, they didn't change their laws. They doubled down on forcing LGBTQ accommodation. And understand that this is the new normal. These leftist states are beginning to practice civil disobedience against Supreme Court rulings. This, they believe, is their Rosa Parks moment. But that's a whole different subject for another day. In this Creative versus Ellenist case, we again read in the dissenting opinion from these leftist judges the same faulty basis for ethics. It's all about outcome rather than principle. Oh, they have their principle that homosexual accommodation must be first on their list of ethical hierarchy. I mean, it's so important that it must trump First Amendment rights, the right to religion and free speech. But again, they arrive at that principle on the basis of what they want, not upon the higher principles of God, the principles of freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. They want Christians and everyone to be forced to support LGBTQ, so they work backwards from that conclusion to come up with the rationale as to why people should be forced to support an ideology they don't believe in morally. In essence, what these leftist judges were arguing for is why a Jewish deli should be forced to make ham sandwiches, why a Jewish flag maker should be forced to make a Nazi flag, why a black sign maker should be forced to make a sign for the KKK, or why a pro-life business should be forced to make pro-choice signs, or why stores should be forced to sell LGBTQ pride merchandise. I wish these justices would have admitted the true reason for their position, that LGBTQ for them is not moral deviance, but righteousness. But they hid it all behind all sorts of irrelevant arguments. Neil Gorsuch wrote about Sotomayor's dissenting opinion that, quote, in some places, the dissent gets so turned around about the facts that it opens fire on its own position. What these justices were saying in their dissent, and really all of the news media, was that this case was like a business refusing to sell to a black man. But it was not. This case was more akin to a business being forced to print leaflets for the Black Panthers or for BLM. This case had nothing to do with intrinsic characteristics, but it had to do with moral ideology. This was a freedom of religion issue. But the left doesn't like the fact that LGBTQ is actually a religious moral issue. They want it to be an innate natural issue, just like the color of one's skin, so they can force people not to discriminate or judge them. Notice the following responses. LA Times. With 303 creative decisions, Supreme Court opens the door to discrimination. Slate. The Supreme Court blessing of anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination will haunt gay people. USA Today. The Supreme Court's 303 creative decision distorts religious freedom. We're no longer equal. New York Times. Supreme Court opens door to discrimination. Let's just stop here and define discrimination. This has always bothered me. When the left uses the word discrimination as always referring to unrighteous discrimination, there is good discrimination, where one discriminates between what is good and evil, as the Bible says, separating between the clean and the unclean. And there's evil discrimination, where one makes judgments on the basis of personal favoritism. But what unprincipled leftists do is link righteous discrimination to unrighteous discrimination by calling all discrimination unrighteous. This way, any moral discrimination they don't like, they can call evil. Because for the ungodly, they hate all moral judgments against them. So therefore, all discrimination is considered evil. Anyway, here are two media outlets that got it right. In editorials by conservatives, in The Atlantic, an article by David French, the most consequential First Amendment case this term, 303 Creative versus Ellenist, isn't about LGBTQ rights, as many people believe it to be, but about what constitutes speech. And in the Wall Street Journal, 303 Creative versus Ellenist is a victory for free speech and pluralism. The Supreme Court supports the right of businesses to dissent from dominant cultural views. Notice again in all of these news reports how there is a completely different view concerning what is right and wrong. People live in totally separate universes based upon their foundation for morals. And notice this. The left is saying it's okay for Harvard to discriminate, but it's not okay for 303 Creative to discriminate. Notice this double standard. The left will demand freedom of religion for LGBTQ, but then protest against any Christianity in the public square. And here's another interesting point. In actual practice, the left is not really against boycotting or refusing to do business with those they disagree with ideologically. They do it all the time, and they encourage others to do the same. But they'll scream bloody murder when you refuse to do business with them. And the left was all fine when the courts were ruling in their favor. They used to ridicule the right for saying these 9 people on the Supreme Court have been given too much power. But now that rulings are not going their way, they're complaining about the power of the courts. Inconsistency is always a characteristic of leftist justice, because their justice is not based upon the immutable law of God, but based upon outcomes. Therefore, at some point, there's going to be contradiction. In one instance, racism is right. In another instance, racism is going to be wrong. In one instance, murder is going to be right. In another, it's going to be wrong. In one instance, theft is wrong. In another, it's right. And this is a real logical problem for the left. They know that in order to push LGBTQ, they're going to have to discriminate against Christians. They're going to have to promote the very thing that they've been saying for years is the greatest evil: discrimination. So I hope we see the different foundations for right and wrong between the right and the left. That's the lesson we should be getting from all of these news stories concerning these 2 Supreme Court rulings. What is frightening is, imagine what America would look like if leftist justice becomes the law of the land. It would result in injustice, or rather justice which would favor that which the Bible calls evil. I mean, we've already seen this in Roe versus Wade. The left's definition of justice resulted in the murder of 60 million innocent children. And the leftist definition of justice will turn America into Sodom. And when the wicked rule, the people will groan. Our nation is really balancing on a knife's edge. The district court and the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals had ruled for Colorado and against this Christian web designer. But the Supreme Court, with just a 2-person conservative majority, was able to stop this legal revolution that the left wants. Remember, when the Antichrist arrives, he will intend to make alterations in times and in laws. The Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his famous work, The Gulag Archipelago, dedicated 3 chapters to how communists, once they were in power, changed the courts and the laws in Russia. Quote, "The interrogations were almost never undertaken to elicit the truth, but simply to eliminate the opposition." End quote. The first question was never, what did the person do? But what was his class? What was his origin? What was his education and upbringing? Was he proletariat or bourgeoisie? And it wasn't whether what you did was right or wrong. What mattered was outcomes. If your factory failed or the harvest was poor, that was the crime. No objective right or wrong, as we are so used to in Christianity, was ever used, but pragmatism. And your crime was that you were simply an enemy of the people because you didn't get along or go along with what the Communist Party agenda was at that time. Quote, "Judges were not guided by right or wrong, but by principles of the revolution. One judge is quoted saying, "We are guided not by laws, but by our revolutionary conscience." And also, quote, after the revolution, for 4 years, there were no codes. They had thrown out the czarist codes, and they had composed their own. Don't tell me about our criminal courts, that they ought to act exclusively on the basis of existing written norms. We live in the process of revolution. A tribunal is not the kind of court in which fine points of jurisprudence and clever stratagems are to be restored. We are creating a new law and new ethical norms. And also, no matter how much is said about the eternal laws of truth, justice, etc., we know how dearly those have cost us. And this is the way it was in those years. People lived and breathed and then suddenly found out that their existence was inexpedient. In 1937, a Russian philosopher taught that it's never possible to establish absolute truth, but relative truth only. So we don't have to be absolutely certain someone is guilty for someone to be guilty. We don't need to look for absolute evidence, for they can say different things at different times. So a judicial ruling is based on one's own conclusions and party sensitivity on truth. The ideology of communism, of which they boasted so enthusiastically, turned Russia upside down, destroying its foundations, trampling everything held sacred underfoot. Unquote, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So does that sound familiar? This is where leftist justice leads. This is where the whole universe ends up if God is not God and Satan and man rule. What the ungodly do to justice is described by the prophet Amos. Amos chapter 6, verse 12. Yet you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. And also Amos chapter 5, verse 6. Seek the Lord that you may live, or he will break forth like a fire, O house of Joseph, and will consume with none to quench it for Bethel. For those who turn justice into wormwood and cast righteousness down to the earth. What does it mean to cast righteousness down to the earth? To take the meaning and the definition of righteousness, not from God's heavenly kingdom, but to take it from the kingdom of man. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. Subscribe, like, and share. Leave a comment below. And may Jesus Christ reign.